So we would like to greet Wangdrak Rinpoche and thanks for joining us today. And I hope the connection will be okay, so we can still talk. And let me introduce, you already view the interviews. Wangdrak Rinpoche is Lama. He's a Lama and Abbot of one of the Abbots of Gebchak Nunnery. And where the nuns doing really, really unique practices. And Elizabeth will be translating. And Elizabeth just, as I mentioned, completed her PhD, and she was doing her PhD on mind-body practices of Gebchak nuns. So we welcome questions from everyone, from audience, and from our participants and panelists to Rinpoche. And then I will start with first questions. And so if Rinpoche can tell us a bit about these mind-body practices that Gebchak nuns are doing. So again, they're very unique because they aim at enhancement of body and mind and interaction. So interaction between mind and body. So how Rinpoche views these practices in this sense, and what are these mind-body practices?
Rinpoche, do you think today? So then it tumbles the country share the Gebchak Wangdrak the Pacher Gibe Nyamlangi Tatalung Tigla Deni Consonium Mental Kariche de Giri Need Dinsoge Semge Nawa the Yuda you change the Semge Nawa de la condition can take to do. Rinpoche just says hello, touch delay, greetings to everybody here. So first of all, Gebchak Nunnery was, from its establishment, always specializing in the Tsalung type yogas. So Tsalung meaning the kind of Prati, Prana, and Nadi. Subtle body yogic practices have been their specialty. And the Tsalung yogas they were doing at Gebchak are not very much at all like the popular yogas that people practice today. Not much in common with that. So if you just observe contemporary yoga, even in India, and you look at the postures and the movements, it can look quite similar to what they're doing at Gebchak, but when it comes to the inside, what's happening in their view, what's happening in the mind is quite different. So at Gebchak Nunnery, working with the Tsa and the Lung and the Tigli, these subtle body constituents, really manipulating these and deliberately employing these in their practice with their meditation, then it's using these sort of material or outer elements to affect this cognitive transformation. So most people would see Tsalung or Tummo practice and think it's something that brings about inner heat, but that's not the real purpose. The inner heat is not why they're doing it. So their purpose is by, again, really deliberately manipulating in a very forceful way these subtle body elements. They're bringing about, you know, an experience of that true nature of reality. In general, all Vajrayana practices and yogas are trying to transform the appearances that are experienced of reality. So generally, you know, our mind is, we're functioning in subject and object. So we know things, we know objects, but somehow that kind of dualistic way of knowing is obscuring the true nature of reality, or even of the object, because there's this constant conditioned conceptual interaction with it. So then the Buddhist approach would be, of course, to start with the shamatha and the vipassana meditation training. And then for those who have like more kind of pointed faculties or more heightened intelligence, like maybe scientists and that type, that can really kind of understand these sort of Vajrayana types, that a more kind of forceful or heightened approach to the nature of reality, by manipulating the whole mind and body, it can bring about a full embodied recognition of the true nature. So Maria, does that answer the first question? Did you want to ask something else about that first question?
Because Rinpoche was mentioning about mind-body practices, right, of Gebchak Nunnery. So what does it mean, mind-body practices, exactly? What's the meaning behind these mind-body practices? The mind and body. Yeah.
The chedang also inji to the drashi jab gona get your gong ginyamle mangcha konto lusem dralam gigoni sungal gigoni nyamle chegi riana semri yana zugri dende konto tayamdo. Then get your gong in your mending to Ludang Semgi, Sundra, Kosundra, the Yudan Yucheng in Yamyong and Andra Konsu Nawangon the Guregi Todu, Ludang Semgi do, the country Yuri. Right, so it's a good question, because yeah, the way they approach and experience their practices, yes, they're mind-body practices. So in these Gebchak Nuns experience, it's not mind or body, one to the exclusion of the other, but they're understood as actually the same by the very nature of reality, like in the very basic essential nature of reality. They are not understood as separate. So like Rinpoche was saying, if you observe popular yoga today, it's a more kind of physical fruition, but at Gebchak Nunnery, it's not caught up in either body or mind.
In contrast to shamatha, right, to the vipassana.
Go ahead, Maria.
I know I just wanted to ask, like shamatha and vipassana would not fall under this category, right? Although they're also not making distinction between body and mind.
Then you remember to get your going that which I shini dan hakong ni chala dinang la kong togwe kong salong in yamlen gan
yenda ye shine ta sampong chatan de sanga dorje te baga lamche salong na na ne tina nan tondo yuri.
Ani pachu chiong ge shini dan hakong di dang sanga dorje te baga shilak di la chiber kari yuri.
De sa ke tene koran so la tene nishok chechong da waje ri ma to ke shine tina nan tu de yuri sampong tina nan tu.
Ani nushok se ondu di supo ge sa dan lungi nushok ko ko be.
Yenda ye aran so ke tene te sa ke koran so ke tene tsalon fon ko tele tene sem ne cha ke tap na yuri sem ne le ke ma se pa ke tene tana tene sampong ke cha sa ba cha tana yuri cha ta tana du de yuri.
So first of all, definitely within at least the Gebchak Vajrayana tradition, that shamatha and vipassana are both very much included in their Vajrayana practice. So, but the difference with just sort of more Mahayana or exoteric shamatha and vipassana would be, again, this sort of forceful methods of the Vajrayana. So in the Tsalung practices at Gebchak, even, the stability and the concentration that you cultivate in shamatha, they are cultivating that one-pointed concentration, but it's through these Vajrayana methods. And then likewise, the awareness of the conceptual activity of your mind, that also, but it's within the Vajrayana method that they're doing that. So generally in the, let's say, exoteric type of shamatha and vipassana, shamatha would be more of just an abiding. One is cultivating an abiding of the mind, a peaceful abiding, often using the breath as the support. And then in vipassana, maybe really looking to the impermanent nature of phenomena and the impure nature of phenomena. Whereas in Vajrayana, although they're also cultivating this abiding, it's not trying to overcome anything. It's more direct. So whatever the experience is in the moment, whatever is arising, that's it. And it's not trying to shun or it's actually engaging. And again, Rinpoche is saying with force, in a forceful, energetic way. It's looking right into the essence of what's arising, rather than, so it doesn't look at the impurity and the impermanence as much as the exoteric approach. So in like the sutra approach to these meditations, and often the stress is on selflessness. One is trying to awaken to selflessness, which of course is not a simple thing to understand. Most people, we don't recognize that. In the Vajrayana, they also teach one is here to realize selflessness, but selflessness in itself means that your self is pure, that they're teaching almost this divine recognition of the very nature of being. And also with outer objects. So when looking at phenomena, it's not looking at them as impermanent and impure, but rather also as pure. Rinpoche dakpa labi ondu tongpa ni la kogurebe. So when Rinpoche is saying pure, in the Vajrayana, you would look even at objects as pure. Rinpoche almost means like the empty nature, that empty potential sort of nature of phenomena. And an empty meaning not nothing, not an absence. So, does that get at your question though about mind and body, Maria?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you, Rinpoche, very much. And we welcome question from our panelists and from audience. And in the meantime, I have one more question to ask, if it's okay. I want to ask a question about different, way of transmitting teaching in Tibet, and particularly in Gebchak Nunnery. So as far as I understand, there are textual studies, right? There are really practices, there are transmissions. So can Rinpoche talk about it and how it is particular in Tibetan community and in particular in Gebchak Nunnery? Like what kind of teachings they receive? Are they textual study or they're doing more practices? How it's play one with another?
Okay, then Rinpoche Gebchak Wangdrak Rinpoche Lobjang Chesu de Cordes Nalo Ches. Then Gebchak Wangdrak Rinpoche Pute Dang Chesu Sumya Dawochi Chigi Reveyana Wang Long Trigger Dawochi Consul the Shecha into Chigi Chikne Kandachani Dungure.
I come for Ambo, no Chonggang, after on this, any Shat and the Yamba and Dome, any Choga, Hani, at the soak Yam Yam Mambo, Jinsa, they soak at the end of the soak Yatu, Yanesi, the Ne after the Nicolas of Tamang, which is here to Yayur, the Ne Sukan from the Hamad of the Ne, Kale in the Pinem Hago, the Prokan and Dome. That is like a minute. So you want to come and do that, so you need to Lama get down. Danga that the Menga that the Nicolas on the Tika Hiatan, Coranso and Yano Hiatan, Jake Anne, gave up the soak, John put the solo Coranso and Yano Kari, but I'm John on the Tene, so John shit, and it will be the Lama and Menga, and it Coranso the Salon for the Jan. That's Suchi over here.
So mostly at Gebchak Nunnery, the nuns traditionally would join fairly young, and they would start by learning the different rituals, even some artistic rituals, and learn reading. And there's lots of things they'd have to spend their time learning to be able to engage in the ceremonies. And then after a few years, then they would start their first 3-year retreat. And the retreat, which he said we could consider a study of sorts as learning, but mainly it's the learning happens through the personalized pith instruction, and often in the retreat center, it's those older nuns that are delivering and sharing their experiential knowledge of the practices to the younger nuns, and then the younger nuns sort of carry them out and demonstrate their understanding. So it's very much a practical learning style of these yogas and practices. And remember, Chief, yigi picha mabo dumba mabo dung yorebe get you gombala. Yigi mabo logorebe.
이게 마고노는 까죠 나오텔로는 다시 말이 프랑스에서는 로아게 소 루치니까 나는 되게 차상 양로다 센지다 나고가 나와 차상 요리돼 되네 계좌상가 안에 체주가를 이루서 되네 나랑 샘되니 야고지 뭐시 샘되니까 완전 신나 서르게 요르다 소리 뭐도 난그 샘되게 파 요르다 완전 이거도 뭐도 서르게 수가 들어오게 손 알아라 그냥 완전 아무도 없어네 이하고.
So at Gebchak Nunnery, they do read a lot of text every day, but the way they read is it's nothing like just reciting sutras. It's not just mere recitation, but most of the reading happens in these drupchens, which are these extended, maybe 10-day long collective sadhana practices, so tantric ritual ceremonies. And so all the reading that they're doing and all the practical learning that they're doing ultimately is to understand how their mind is the creator, and so that the mind, the accomplishment is when they realize their mind is the master of appearances, and appearances meaning the way we experience reality. That's the whole point of their reading and learning.
서로 용서 셈을 포도 하고 셈되니까 파요로 왕조 투자를 하고 나지 근데 계좌상 그렇게 하고 지금 소리로 그렇게 되지에 조란 같은 세계다 세미 근데 담아 되게 도당다 제가 이놈의 차상상도 요리.
So the goal is to understand how all the suffering and the happiness of life is really, it comes down to the mind. The mind creates that. And so that it's not the outer world that influences oneself, but rather one's own mind is the master of the outer world. And they do this through, the Vajrayana path of generation stage and completion stage, and then the yoga is the completion stage with characteristics, and the completion stage without characteristics, and the Dzogchen meditation, and so forth. So in a nutshell, the kind of Vajrayana definition of what they're learning is to transform all impure experience into pure experience. So Rinpoche is saying that much of science nowadays is actually understood, comprehended emptiness, and can explain that, but it doesn't mean that we've experientially understood it. We haven't realized it. And Rinpoche is saying that when he talks about the mind becoming a master of reality, really it's very much similar to the kind of modern quantum physics idea of waves and particles and how form manifests and so forth. That it's possible within a small room for the entire universe to be experienced by somebody. Some of these yogis in Tibet staying in a small cave and just eating their roasted barley flour, they could have this quite fantastic, experience of the whole cosmos.
And we have a question. We have a question from Lawrence.
First of all, thank you very much for all of that insight into the practices in the nunnery. The question I want to ask is whether sometimes some people, or perhaps many or a few, end up having a lot of difficulty at a certain point in their practice, to the point that they become very distressed and they can't continue, or it seems like that, and how you deal with that, if that happens, how you deal with that.
So you mean at Gebchak Nunnery, or in Tibet at Gebchak Nunnery, right? Rinpoche, the Vajrayana Nangchen, Chidang Kam Nangchen, the Lakpa, the Gebchak Gongi, Chisok, and Alola Kapkap, La Conso, Drape, Taplam being so la Teni Conso Nyaman Dram, and Chegi, and Kapkap La meeting so la Sem La Kanga Chegi, then a sense up chair down, Wangdrak chair down, Conso, Tunang Mambo Shaya down, Sem, there's a Tang Tang major that which is Chagre.
to use they get in a day so home. Monkey, you now a dollar on it. Monkey, you come now a dollar on it. You see, they let in it. Mango, Nondoya, Sam Majiba. Madaji Neso Peter and Tondo Yuri. The name, I get anything in a Lama, Dangana, Minga, Dangana, the soul of the name has any comments on the water. Because on a better thing, good now a day, don't want to continue in a place of Kanga, Homodo.
So I'll just answer the first part and then ask what they do if it happens in the second. And first of all, at Gebchak Nunnery, they haven't had any experience of like serious psychosis and the kind of problem of not being able to sleep well, insomnia, that sort of thing doesn't happen really at Gebchak. And Rinpoche feels the main reason for that is because they have a very much an intact system of the pith instructions. So a lot of qualified practitioners around them that can constantly be there to point out what's happening, the appearances that people are experiencing. So they would say when psychosis happens or an unhappy mind happens, they would say Nangwa Dadulonga, which means the appearances in your mind, the conceptual activity in your mind, you project it outside, so it becomes an external enemy. So if they've got a lot of qualified mentors around to be there for the individual, to be pointing out and to be interacting with them, to guide them through those mental experiences, then that usually kind of preempts there being a lot of problems. Then tang major da which ducha chaksona chinamba nimbo kari jagari Rinpoche.
At the solo consultation there, the local Kashi Nasa Down Jimba, a Kashi Modo, same time major than Ching Ramadaji, they only Tranek is all and Yoma, the same time major, the Dermago, same time major, the Gebchak on the Quans of the desert, Danga to some water, now one joke, Danga to some water, and I am now Kamayan water. Kashi Chicken Ramada, Chicken Ramada, and the Tibetan Chicken, now one joke, water.
So generally, yeah. So Rinpoche's answer here is pretty much the same. That really you don't really see extreme psychosis happening as a result of the practices, and in some cases maybe some women are joining the nunnery with unstable minds. I've actually seen this too, where they join and maybe their minds aren't very stable, but then over time as they engage with the community and they get a lot of guidance from again qualified mentors, so that they're able to really work with what's happening in their mind, then they tend to heal.
At the sort of Dama Mamboji, only a Sahara, Chishu Mamboji here, the Rankan Zambal and Mamman Chishu, National Drat, song, Megichen Hong song, Check C song, Ramada, Egg song, Check, where you know, which is the sort of the 12 you, how a dollar, the sort of Hala in the Mama, what is your over you? The sort of the chance and it also your sent it studying about half of you, and it's been missing a young.
So actually talking about the instructions, like the way that teaching occurs in the Vajrayana community is really quite important, because nowadays most education happens through, we read a lot and we see a lot and we hear a lot, and we accumulate a lot of information and it fills our minds. So it's almost like something from the outside that then influences us. But of course the Vajrayana approach is much more the subject and object isn't so separate, so that it's really entailing the very nature of the knowing mind. And Rinpoche is saying Rikpitsel and Semgitsel. So tsel is a word for, you could translate that as energy or creative expression. So it's this really kind of energetic, creative aspect of the knowing mind that is triggered and involved in this exchange. And Rinpoche keeps saying about becoming a master of appearances, so that the mind is the creator, the mind is known as the master of one's experience. So reality as we know it, that's available to us now, to men, women, whoever we are, wherever we are. That's something that's it's a potential for each of us right now. It's the nature of things. So it's really about truly knowing the nature of reality and without any obscuration. That's really the whole point, and that's the meaning of Buddhahood in their tradition. You know, so Buddhism, of course, is teaching that the relative appearances are created by the mind. So shapes and colors. This is something that, you know, even neuroscience understands about how, you know, color doesn't exist in the object. It's something that our mind creates. So we understand that intellectually, but we still have this habit, this conceptual fixation on believing it to be real. So one example is if you were a magician and you could create a mirage, a very realistic looking mirage of a beautiful woman, even the magician might create that mirage, but it can look so real and so beautiful that even he would become attached to the mirage. It's much like that, the way our minds work. So in fact, the magician created that mirage, and it's not really existing out there at all. And he kind of knows that, but still he's engaging with it like it's real. That's how our ordinary minds work. And so, yeah, so then there's this issue of there being some kind of obscuration between subject and object, that is, you know, a dualistic way of knowing reality somehow obscures it. So, you know, back to Vajrayana practices, that when it comes to becoming a master of appearances, this is the kind of real understanding they're trying to get to, is just cutting through that. So using these forceful energetic methods of Salung and Chungkor, the kind of physical yogas, they're trying to, with the whole mind and body, cultivate that knowing, full knowing of reality. And there's this analogy of milk has the potential for butter, like butter is there in the milk. But if you don't churn the milk, you don't get the butter. So you have to use these practices to get butter. And then Rinpoche Rinpoche's given an analogy of a snake. So if a snake is tied in a knot, you can't tell that it has arms and legs. And I'm not going to translate this well because I have no idea what he means. But so if a snake is tied in a knot, you don't know if it has arms or legs. But when it's untied, it becomes clear where its arms and legs are. And he's asking all of you scientists if you know. Apparently, it's a traditional example they give in Tibet. And he's wondering if you scientists sort of know about the arms and legs of a snake.
This is a trick question.
So they have a lot of these traditional ancient examples in their texts in Tibet, a lot of them coming from like Nalanda in India, sometimes describing a cow and the different features of a bull, which in Tibet, Rinpoche grew up sort of trying to understand what that meant because he'd never seen it before. At any rate, this snake example is one that they use. The point is that if you really engage in these Salung practices, then you're getting, you're able to get that potential, which is the true knowing of reality, becoming a master of appearances. Lasso Rinpoche. Any two young chichi?
We have another question from audience, and I actually a bit rephrase this question because I'm also interested. We have research in science showing that with meditative practice, the areas in the brain related to self-perception, related to self, they stop being activated that much. So it clearly shows that the idea of self is diminishes. So, but what, according to Rinpoche, what does it mean selflessness? What does it mean no self? And also, like Rinpoche mentioned about master of appearances, does it mean this master have no self? Can Rinpoche elaborate on this?
Rinpoche, then if you are kakuchik nangsong, then pachir tensang lepa tsenepa tenso gom shilak gom la tene lepa ge nangso this dakzin la gom shik chutua. Dakzin da dak sena dak nga da in dakzin da wochi. The digi lepa na la chashi mixa chi usere any gom nyaman na tene koronda se korang kuyampu chagadu ko medudu. Sili dida se nyamdudu. Tani dak me se di dak me se di the dak me se ondu any now want to jury on the dik dak koran mindue tani dak me sa du cheran dak me se ondu karela koko ire.
So yeah, the current coco you read to the Mujo Nara, chick you, Tinta, Naran, Timba, some fun over chick. You're the Timba is Tony Mato, Tender Mato, Tony Mato, Tender Mato, but then he.
Then it dark me say it. So dark me say it.
Me to the current on no, son to kitchen. That's it. They party. Kori Santo Kinchik, Vigili, but Chatan to go on. We've net from the turn to Kinchik that is that to you. We've net of the Nankorohak on a bit of time.
Then it dark me toy on the then it could dark document way, Ben as lag is ancient that which you can't document way. So basically, what they mean by the self and the ego or the self grasping, the false self grasping is this very sort of concrete sense of self, this real belief in an independent self that's not in perspective with reality, so it doesn't have it's not in context of interdependent arising. There's this very fixated idea of other and self. It's very reified, conceptually reified, and it's confused. So it's not in perspective at all. Whereas the realization of selflessness then is sort of that non-dual realization, and there's no conceptually truly existing self there in any way. And I just asked Rinpoche, but in Tantra, if you're identifying as a deity, then does one not exist almost in a divine way? And he said, not at all. There's never any no truly existing self of any kind or any phenomena. And it's crucial to understand when we talk about realizing selflessness or attaining Buddhahood, often we think of it as attaining something else or going somewhere else, transcending and going somewhere else. So that's really not what's meant. That as we are right now, minus the confusion, that's it. So minus that obscuration and that conceptual reification, that's it. That is the goal. And when that's realized, that's the meaning of enlightenment. But it's quite hard to realize and complex actually, and without really reliable experience and guidance from somebody, but with that reliable guidance, then we can really gain a full understanding of the universe. That because the nature of reality really is not dualistic, that it's an interdependence of subject and object. Because of that, everything is possible. So all of the technology, the phones, and all of that is possible because of this interdependent nature of reality. And so if we understand that sort of teaching of the mind is the master, is really the one in control of reality and how it's experienced, it's actually quite simple. Rinpoche says that with much respect for all of you, and when it comes to understanding phenomena and objects of knowledge, that really you're all much better, and quite a lot of sophistication, and which Rinpoche doesn't have, and he says his community in Tibet maybe hasn't had, but they do have this tradition of understanding the mind, and Rinpoche has been fortunate to have some excellent instruction from qualified teachers. So he says he does have some little understanding of how the mind works. And what's strange, especially in the Vajrayana, is that you have this knowledge that's not knowing itself as a subject, and it's not knowing an object. It's hard to put into words, but it's self-knowing, but it's not knowing itself as a subject. It's not subject or object, but it's self-knowing. That's strange, isn't it? Anyway, she's been telling jokes in front of a lot of scientists today, but anyway, that's how it is.
And one more question about, about the future of these practices, of these sound practices in Tibet. So I understand that Gebchak Nunnery probably is the only nunnery or monastery which is doing ceremony of dry and wet sheet, that's seriously still going through Tummo teachings. So how Rinpoche is seeing the future, like what is the future of these Vajrayana practices and what happened with them, let's say in like 25 years?
네, rinpoche tuwa thama de nganso maung patunglan de sanotana po khangjin jong la pachu tanda gecho gomba de bena lo rede ki thumo ki chure ki duchin chea dang nyama Nangchen khandra yoba de jitawa shin du sunchu chea de pachu gecho gomba de gomba chea gi nane korang chipo insere tende chi yimba yina nganso maung palo nishu tsanga dawa chi ki jela samotana tsalung tigli gi nyamlen gubi nyamlen de so khandra chin yong sare thola
Baba Manya Padaw, Jay, Secretary, Son Jock, you take a Durab and Jova Rede. And it Durab Rede, the Mugachi order, the Maka Sumham, the Mambo, Japan, your son, your and a Mambo, over you, that's okay. Ranga Yuri, Yanaya, Hot Pupa, Sankan Yami, say, must say, and I am go Yuri, Hatote, when I get to me, Sankan Yami, Sahakan Yami, and go on it. I can't got this again.
Ine ngemanashin bena ngoni gecho gomba dawo chiki ta wanglung tika ani salung kitli gidu bena na chatsawa di sungchu chi tuya la khanga tegere tege mari samgudu
This secretary, yena yang sapam jot konhan lando sapam jot konhan do magu ma cha yondo wa sa yondo to soro la short pam jot la short that na the kanga yeda yang yoda yo saka koryo ne tan tan ma mango chi ke chanye mango chi ke kanga chi yodo wa ya ko
ta thanda charam sachala ta mimang dang ta mimang chewala nyamnan di chegre ben salung kitli nyamnan
Nangchen go janki nyame sinki isanga do ti te lam soni zonde teza kitne lanon to sona tene bana kaju ba enanda nyama ba enanda yonzo kitne bana apana ndo ya ela nyame siya de pe milsi dena na ma se ba kitne tsanon ke nyame dele tene den sa te se ya ke chang ke yuri kare sana tene lukun chodin la pando tang la yang pando tene chasang na te se ke ne so musa ki vida
Yeah, so in every age, every century, there's changes and these practices have to adapt to the needs of the time and to the psychology of the people of that time. But at any time in history, these are always needed. People always need these practices. So Rinpoche feels quite optimistic that in the future, because these practices are so beneficial in Tibet, at least, that they'll survive and do well. There is some because the value system is shifting so much into, a materialism in Tibet, the economic development, and most people now are really kind of are really kind of dazzled by outer material. But today, at least presently, in all the Kagyu and the Nyingma communities there, all of those monks and nuns would be engaging in the Tsalung practices. And right now, actually, there's an improved appreciation of them because now they know that they're good for your physical health as well as for your mental health. They've got that modern awareness of them. So there's more interest than there was even a little bit a few years ago. So it feels quite optimistic. Loud and richy.
Sabjang we go to Gompa Pun, go to the Tenitim, at the Naka Goshi Minayang, then it's all on from hotelity. Then it says like a Tene, Hanopina Pendo, then it's Sena Yame on the look, Chatan the day, the Tenitis and Trunkote, there's like a Tene, Dada, Salon Yami, so that is like a Tene, Mango Chicatana Pendo, Nela Pendo, Putina Pendo, Chatan Pendo.
So recently, Rinpoche has a couple of friends that have diabetes. So they engaged in Tsalung practices to try and heal their diabetes, and they really found it helped actually. So, people are recognizing that these traditional practices are actually really good just for physical health as well as the whole mind body. That's our Rinpoche. That to be told in Tari.
Jonathan Kuno Yapotelati, the example lane, the Nites, Chulo Kitcha Thor, and I Chulo the Chingo Kitcha Thor, and the Rang and answer to the two line down, Delatin, the Jamon, and Mamma, Chulo, the number May, 얘는 야 얘는 때문에 왜 그래서 내 손이 가는 거는 통투야. 단다지게 되네 레와 첨부요.
Anyway, Rinpoche really appreciates the intentions behind this conference and the dialogue. And when talking with Vajrayana, it doesn't have to be religious. We don't need to get caught up in religious sectarianism or even religion. So he really appreciates the efforts for this conversation.
And we really appreciate Rinpoche being with us today. Rinpoche, thank you very much for really deep discussion, and it was very nice to have you here.
How's the time, Maria? I just sort of lost track of the time.
We are closer to the end of our session, and
okay. Okay. So Rinpoche.
Rinpoche, thanks a lot for your.
I'll just put him on mute and we'll just hang on till I might just listen here.
Okay, so I think then we'll finish our sessions for today, and I will see you all tomorrow, I hope, for the next session at 5 p.m.